11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Go for main engine start. Main engine start. 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery, returning to the space station, paving the way for future missions beyond.
Welcome to the Orbital Perspective Podcast, where we dolly zoom out to a perspective where upcoming megatrends become visible. Every day, it is more and more apparent that we are in the midst of the great transition. Everything is changing rapidly. The fundamentals of business, government, and society are being rewritten almost on a daily basis. We are truly living during a time where the riskiest course of action is to stay the course. The most hazardous path is to take the tried and true. We are also living during a time where it is becoming more and more apparent that the status quo is not working. At least it's not working for everyone. And until the status quo is working for everyone, we will do nothing more than slap temporary band-aids on our problems and our challenges. We are presently dealing with crisis after crisis. But these crises can serve as a wake-up call. They can be our call to action to incorporate the changes necessary to make us all more resilient and better equipped to deal with the future crises that will undoubtedly come our way. The Orbital Perspective is all about transcending the divisive walls that separate us and embracing the awe and wonder of our shared humanity. What all the guests on the Orbital Perspective podcast have in common is they are all able to see things from a slightly different perspective. And when we look at issues from different perspectives, we see things in stereoscopic vision. Multiple perspectives allow us to see the depth of a situation below the two-dimensional us versus them surface. The other thing all our guests have in common is they are all proof that you don't have to be in orbit to have the orbital perspective. Now, this is not an interview, and it's also not just a conversation between two friends. It's a conversation amongst all of us. If you're listening live, please post your questions and your comments so that we can bring you into the conversation. And if you're listening to the recorded conversation, still please join in with your comments and questions and be a part of this evolving community. Thank you for being here and being a part of this conversation from the Orbital Perspective. Hi, everyone. Happy Veterans Day. I want to start off by saying thank you. Thank you to all the veterans out there. Thank you to everybody who has served. I think not everybody realizes that the sacrifice of military members is 24/7, regardless if we're in wartime or in peacetime. And it's not just the servicemen or the servicewomen that are making those sacrifices. It's the entire family. It's the children, the parents, the spouses of those. So a very, very special thanks to everyone who sacrifices, who works so hard, and is so dedicated to preserving the freedoms that we all cherish so dearly. And I think what military service does, I think it really brings out a wonderful aspect of human nature, and that is the ability to have service beyond self, to see something bigger than ourselves, whether it's our unit or our squad, our squadrons or our service or our nation. It's to be able to see and sacrifice for those things that we perceive as greater than us. We're part of it, but the overarching structure is greater than us. And I think that is an incredibly powerful human trait. It's probably the human trait that has enabled us to go from a weak, insignificant species to basically the rulers of the world. This ability to participate in something that's bigger than all of us, and that camaraderie, that unity is never more needed than right now. We need to realize that we really, really are all in this together. We really need to come together and realize that we are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And that's this moment in history. It's more important than ever to realize that. And so my guest today epitomizes service before self, serving something bigger than oneself. Jacqueline Novogratz is personally responsible for lifting millions of people around the world out of destitute poverty. And she is one of my heroes, and I'm really excited that we're going to have a really interesting conversation today. With that, I'm going to introduce Jacqueline Novogratz. Jacqueline Novogratz is the New York Times best-selling author of The Blue Sweater. Her second book, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, Practices to Build a Better World, was published in May of 2020. I was so impressed with Jacqueline's first book, The Blue Sweater, that I took it with me to space on my half-year mission back in 2011. In 2001, Jacqueline founded Acumen with the idea of investing philanthropic patient capital in entrepreneurs seeking to solve the toughest issues of poverty. As a pioneer of impact investing, Acumen and its investments have brought critical services like healthcare, education, and clean energy to hundreds of millions of low-income people. After supporting hundreds of entrepreneurs, Jacqueline and her team recognized character as the crucial ingredient for success. In 2020, they launched Acumen Academy to instruct others in global social change. Under Jacqueline's leadership, Acumen has also launched several for-profit impact funds designed to invest at the intersection of poverty and climate change, and has spun off 60 Decibels, founded on the principle that serving all stakeholders is as important as enriching shareholders. Jacqueline has been named one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy, one of the 25 smartest people of the decade by the Daily Beast, and one of the world's 100 greatest living business minds by Forbes, which also honored her with the Forbes 400 Lifetime Achievement Award for Social Entrepreneurship. Everybody, please help me welcome Jacqueline Novogratz. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, Ron. It's great to be here. And what a beautiful introduction to everyone. I also want to join you in wishing everyone happy Veterans Day, and to thank all of the veterans for the service they've given. And just, you're bringing me back to when we first met and how blown away I was when you told me that you had my book up in space. And so just thank you for having me, Ron.
It's my pleasure. And you being a military brat, or a child of a military member, to put it more accurately, I guess, I think you understand that the sacrifice is amongst the whole family. And so thank you for all those years that you put up with your dad traveling around and going from this place to that place, and thank him for his service.
Well, I appreciate that you say that. You also made me think about that. You know, he actually served 3 tours in Vietnam and Korea, and I'm the eldest of 7. And so thinking about what a partnership they had, and the ideas of duty, as you said, and service to something beyond yourself is just, I feel so grateful that I could be part of that.
Thank you. So let's talk about the Blue Sweater. And to start off, let me explain to everybody why I took your book, The Blue Sweater, into space with me. I was just really, really blown away by, first of all, by the example you used to prove the fact that we live in this interconnected world. So the title of the book is The Blue Sweater. Actually, the subtitle is Bridging the Gap Between the Rich and Poor in an Interconnected World, right? And so your proof that we live in an interconnected world is you were walking along in the streets of Kigali, Rwanda, and you saw a kid wearing a blue sweater that you recognized, and when you were a kid, you had a blue sweater just like that, and you went up and you said hi, and it turned out it was the blue sweater that you gave to Goodwill like 10 years before, right? I mean,
yeah, had my name written on the tag.
Yeah. So that's the perfect example of what happens in one part of the world that affects everything else. And every thought, word, and action that we have on a daily basis ripples out and not only affects the trajectory of our own lives, but the trajectory of the entire society in many, many, many lives. And your book really drove that home in a real way. And It's interesting. You also epitomize, I think, the orbital perspective, because there's a term called the overview effect, which is the shift in perspective that some astronauts describe after seeing the planet from space and in space. And it was coined by Frank White in his book, The Overview Effect. And Frank and I are good friends, and we've had many, many conversations about this. And we've both come to the conclusion that if the overview effect is the shift in perspective that one has when they have this aha moment, the orbital perspective is what you do with it. The orbital perspective is the call to action that comes from the overview effect. And I think the blue sweater is a perfect example of that. You had your overview effect moment, right? You saw this kid on the streets of Kigali wearing your sweater, and you didn't just stop there. You had a call that gave you a call to action. And your call to action has resulted in millions of people being lifted out of destitute poverty. And I think that epitomizes what I try and describe in the orbital perspective, and why in the book, The Orbital Perspective, I have so many stories in there about folks who exhibit that without ever having been to space, because you don't need to be in orbit to have the orbital perspective. And I think you exemplify that perfectly.
Well, thank you for that. We also, though, I don't know if you remember this, Ron, because you shared with me when we first met, that when you saw the Earth from space, even though it may sound cliche, that there were no lines, there were no boundaries, you also realized what a fragile oasis this tiny, tiny planet was, and that for the rest of your life, you wanted to work on actually erasing these arbitrary boundaries that we put between ourselves so that we can focus on the biggest issues of our time together. And that was so resonant with me that I just felt instant kinship. And so you helped me also reframe in ways that I won't forget. So,
well, thank you for that. And the last time we saw each other in person, we were walking through Muir Woods together, hugging some trees. Not really, but appreciating nature. So I want to encourage everybody who's tuning in live. Thank you for tuning in live, and be a part of this conversation. Give us your questions and your comments, and we'll try and jump right into it. So let's talk about Acumen for a couple minutes. Can you just give everybody the objectives? Well, first of all, how it started and what it evolved to.
Yeah. So when you talked about that blue sweater, I found that in Kigali, Rwanda, in 1986, to date myself. When I was there to create the first microfinance bank in the country with a small group of Rwandan women, I had come there after having worked on Wall Street, mostly in Latin America in the early 80s. And in Latin America, on Wall Street, what I saw was that markets have a real role to play, but too often they overlook or exclude the poor. Rwanda, I saw what top-down approaches to charity and aid could do. And I also saw how they too often create dependence. And so I kept focusing on what would we create if we actually used the tools of the market and understood the role of government more effectively, starting by solving the problems of poverty, and importantly, defining poverty not as the absence of wealth, but the absence of dignity. And so Acumen was born in 2001. At the heart of it was this idea of patient capital. We would raise philanthropy, and then we would invest long-term equity and debt, 10 to 15 years, in entrepreneurs that were daring to solve clean water and healthcare and housing and energy and agriculture and education, the basic services to people that made a couple of dollars a day. We would accompany those entrepreneurs with management services and with connections to other partners that could help them. And any money that came back to Acumen would be reinvested in innovation for the poor. Over time, we saw that wasn't enough, even though that approach has helped us invest about $140 million, move another $700 million into our companies to really change the lives of 300 million low-income people around the world. But we also saw, and you met some of these guys when you were in the space station. I don't know if you remember this as well. We saw that capital isn't enough to solve our problems. We've got to really build human talent. And so we started a university, if you will, called Acumen Academy, the World School for Social Change. And on that, we have a whole series of courses, accelerators, ways to start to build a global community of change makers across race, class, ethnicity, religion, because we believe that innovation and change has to come from everywhere. And that's also produced remarkable ideas and community and innovations, because at this moment in our history, it's so clear that all of us are needed to solve our toughest problems.
You know, a common theme that I found in both The Blue Sweater and Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, your new book, which I'm in chapter 4 of, I have to admit, I'm not all the way through it yet. But a common theme in there is the ability to listen, right? To not come into an area or not come into a situation thinking that we already have all the answers. And for that requires a certain level of humility, right? And so can you maybe talk about that, since you've written so much on it and you've applied it so much in your life and your career, and how we can apply that, how our listeners can apply that to the divisiveness that we find ourselves in right now?
Yeah, and I'm glad you went to the divisiveness, because if we look around, particularly in this political moment, I think none of us would feel that our leaders are listening. In fact, they seem to be doing everything but to one another. And that applies to making change altogether. It applies to everything in our lives. And so, as you said, when I first went to save the world,
Yeah.
What I found so often was that I came in with my own assumptions of what people needed, and found very quickly that most people don't want to be saved, certainly not by foreigners who didn't fully have an understanding of what their issues were, what their situation was. And that it was my job to listen, not from a place of certainty, but from a place of inquiry. And that's really where the humility comes in. I have so many examples of it, but probably the best would be it came late, and it's a funny story. Even after we had built this solar company that has now brought 100 million people electricity and solar energy across Africa and South Asia, this was earlier on, probably 7-8 years ago. But it was a real success. We knew it. And we knew that if you offered people affordable, accessible, attractive solar products, people would make the switch if they could pay for it in ways that made sense for their economic situation. And then I was in Pakistan, where the company had not yet established operations. And it was literally like 122-degree day. I was sitting outside with a group of women weavers. And it was so hot, even the cows were lying down. And so I was talking to the women about their lives. They were part of a bank that we helped build. And I said to them, we've got this solar company in Africa and India, and it's fundamentally changed people's lives. And if we brought it to Pakistan and got the license for it here, would you all be interested in buying it? And this big woman leaned forward, sweat dripping down her face, and she said, "We're hot. We don't want a light. Bring us a fan." And I was like, "A fan? I don't have a fan. We have a light. But with this light, you can stay up later, you can work, your children can study." And she cut me off. And she said, "We work enough. Bring us a fan."
Yeah.
And it was such a moment for me. I thought I was this great listener. And if you ask people and they feel that you actually care about the answer, they'll tell you. We have to ask. And sure enough, now we've got many of our companies actually distribute through Pakistan. And it's so, I always smile when I go to really hot places and you see home units that will not sell unless you have at least one fan as part of the unit. Right. So it's simple. When you're talking about listening across lines of difference, Ron, I think there's a skill set we have to do a much better job at teaching our children and frankly practicing ourselves. And that is, particularly in really tense situations, it's not enough to say, blue, no, red, no, blue, no, red. We don't get anywhere. Can we instead say, I hear something in what you've said. Let me acknowledge it. And let me find even a shred of truth in what you're saying, to open up a space. And when you do that, it's highly likely that the person on the other side will see that space and take a tiny step toward you.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean you give up your principles.
Right.
But it means you acknowledge the other person as a full human being. And that's what we're missing.
Right. That you just hit the nail on the head with that. Acknowledging the other person as a full human being. That's where we've lost out, because the first thing that normally happens in these, I don't even want to call them conversations, but these shouting matches, is that they belittle the person on the other side of the camera, the other side of whatever, the phone, the internet, to something less than human, something certainly less intelligent than human, certainly less intelligent than the person who's speaking. So we need to all listen better. And thank you all for the questions and comments that are coming in. So let's be good listeners, and let's address one. Here's a one that's really good from Jason, a tough one. Does erasing borders equal globalism? How can we protect values such as privacy, individualism, and freedoms from elitist ambitions? How can we not forget that capitalism, such as in the US, has helped fund most of the world's benevolence? How can we protect these freedoms? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a great question. And in a way, it goes to my belief in that what we really have to do is to hold the different values that you laid out in tension. That we're at a moment in our history where we are irrefutably interdependent on each other. And our biggest problems, like climate change, like the pandemic, must be solved globally. And yet, if we only think and act globally, we completely miss what it means to be rooted in community, be kind to our neighbors, ensure that there is equity within countries and across countries. And that's why I think so many of our answers need to lie in locally rooted and globally connected solutions. The second thing I would say is, I love that, when I talk about dignity, what I'm talking about is choice, it's freedom, it's the ability to make your own decisions. And that's what we're after. But markets by themselves do that for some people, but not all people. That's something that we've actually seen with globalization. In fact, I talk about the market as a listening device, but in so many of our sectors, it's too broken to listen. And so we've got a couple that desire for just markets and freedom, with the acknowledgement that we also need community, that we also need to protect the poor and the vulnerable. And it's in that nexus that we find the most creative and generative innovations and opportunities. And that's been the real joy of my life. And I hope that one contribution that Acumen can make is to bring forward these kinds of innovations that reach the most people and essentially set them free.
What's interesting, you've been very, very successful throughout your career, and there's lots of reasons for that success. Your intelligence, your drive, your dedication. But also, I think one of the big reasons why Acumen and you yourself are so successful is because you have embraced hope, you've embraced awe and wonder, you've seen value where other people couldn't see value. And I think part of the reason, if not the main reason, why you're able to do that is because you're not embracing fear. Fear is a very strong motivator, but it's a strong motivator for short-term action. It's not. I don't think it's a strong motivator for real long-term, sustainable, lasting progress. Starting from a foundation of awe and wonder, starting from a foundation of hope, I think is. And to address Jason's question about globalism, maybe one quick story that I'll share is on my second mission when I returned to Earth, and when we landed in our Soyuz capsule, I just remember this thought just washing over me over and over again. I'm home, I'm home, I'm home. And it felt so good to be home. And then the thought dawned on me, I'm home, but I'm in Kazakhstan. And so in that moment, my home wasn't just, Houston, Texas, or at the time I lived with my family. Home was Earth. And then I thought, wow, did my definition of the word home just change, or did it broaden it, or was it broadened? And if it was broadened, does that mean I have to relinquish all those things that I defined as home before? Does that mean that I'm any less American if I think home is Earth? And the answer came really forcefully. Of course not. Thinking ourselves, and I don't use the word global because global is we don't live on a globe, we live on a planet, and global doesn't take into account the biosphere of Earth. And so I think of myself as a planetary citizen, a citizen of Earth. And so thinking of ourselves in that term, as a planetary citizen, doesn't make us any less American or German or Rwandan or whatever it is. It simply means we see our national identity within the context of the bigger picture. And in that context, it makes all of us stronger. It doesn't make us weaker. It makes us stronger because we have, and in the introduction to the podcast, it talks about having multiple points of view gives us the depth of a situation. It allows us to solve the real problems, not the symptoms of the problems. It allows us to act on hope and on wonder and not just act, reactively to fear. And I think that's a really important thing. You don't have to give up that national identity to realize that you're part of a family of nations that's within a biosphere that we call Earth.
Well, I love that. Ron. And I actually think that there are metaphors all the way throughout our lives. I mentioned that I'm one of 7, and we're all really big personalities with very independent lives, yet we have a very strong identity as a family. And yet, maybe because that identity was so strong, we were always the household that every other kid in the neighborhood wanted to sit at the table with. And so our house was always full with many, many other people. And we began to see ourselves as part of this chosen family as well as our biological family. And I think it's that same metaphor that we've all got to do a better job becoming both patriots and citizens of the planet, as you would say.
Yeah.
Because when we move from a wholeness and sense of strength and identity, I think we can see what others bring in really powerful ways too. And certainly that's been my experience. When we decided to take Acumen's work, which had started off focusing on absolute poverty, so places like Rwanda, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, to America, not only was it exciting to see what we could do by bringing innovations here as well as exporting it elsewhere, but it meant a lot to our fellows and to our communities around the world that we were acknowledging how much work there was to be done in the United States.
Right.
And I think, again, it comes to, are we willing to hold the tensions?
Yeah. And, our mutual friend, Muhammad Yunus, has done the same thing. He started Grameen in Bangladesh, and then there's Grameen America now offering, microfinance loans. The other thing is, we both spent some time in Rwanda, and the time in Rwanda and my time, traveling around the world with Muhammad Yunus and really seeing people from all over the world in destitute poverty really redefined my view of poverty. And I, everywhere I went, I saw resourceful, well-meaning, ambitious folks who were primarily being held down by their situation. And they just needed things like, microfinance or some type of, way to get to the starting line, basically, to get out of that cycle of poverty that is multi-generational in many cases. Speaking of that, I think we have another good question here from Rosario. Were you connected, Jacqueline, to the bottom of the pyramid market approach serving most underserved people? If so, then evolved into developing human talent as you shifted focus from market to education to drive quality, sustained impact at scale?
Um, in a way, I think I'm just pragmatic, and Ron was talking about when we were both in Rwanda. I think we had similar experiences. I was working in Rwanda at a time when the average income was $112 per year. Yeah. And so we truly were talking about serious poverty. And yet what I saw there, and I have seen in every country around the world, was this striving to be upwardly mobile in low-income people. And so often the charity approach was not allowing people to solve their own problems. And so it just made sense to me. I didn't know any of the terminology at the time. But when we decided to start Acumen, we weren't any longer looking at microfinance, $30, $50 loans and investments. We were looking at $250,000, $1 million investments on entrepreneurs that we thought not only had insight, but the capability of building real solutions to solve problems. And I learned a number of things on that path. One, as you say, that human capital is as important, if not more important, than the right kind of financial capital. And so that's when we really started to make those investments. And also in character, finding the individuals with the resilience, the grit, the ability to listen. And then importantly, where I think we were short-sighted is we thought the market could do more than it could. And certainly when you were looking at areas like public education or primary education, primary healthcare, clean water, the only way you would actually get to reach millions of people rather than thousands of people was to partner with government. And that's a whole other skill set. Mm-hmm. And so it's been a journey for me, but it started with the capital, and now it is much more focused on building the right kinds of ecosystems. But the North Star, and it goes back to the first question, is what does it take to allow people to move themselves out of poverty?
Yeah, and again, we talked about this earlier. One of the secret ingredients is the ability to listen. And I do want to jump into the Manifesto for Moral Revolution a little bit, because your new golden rule is that we need to give back more to the world than we take. And if I could, I want to read a couple of quotes from your book. You say, "Our hearts and our heads are divided at precisely the time when we most need them to work in tandem." And then you go on to say, "Those in positions of authority, anyone whose words might carry greater weight than the voices of others, need to listen more and not assume because the rules work for them that they know what works for everyone. Listening effectively can influence the way we perceive others in all directions. Just as being poor says nothing about one's character, neither does one's bank account that marks them as rich." And I just want to pop up a question from Luana, or a comment. "The world needs leaders now to speak out and give others permission to speak the truth in their communities and families, which includes using compassion and safe meeting place. What we've forgotten is how to listen as a country."
Thanks for that, Luana.
So I think that you are able to do what you've done in Rwanda and other places of the world mostly because of your ability to listen. That is being able, you can't solve real problems without an ability to listen. If you already know all the answers, then you're not going to learn anything. And I think that's what you've proven. So
what's ironically, Acumen's superpower, right? It's not that we're smarter than anybody. It's that we're probably more curious. And we really want to understand the people that we are there, not to quote unquote help, but to serve and to partner with. And you've mentioned Rwanda a few times, and I really do believe that is a place where I learned that listening by itself can be not only an act of hope and an act of love, but it's an act of activism. And I started this bank 7 years before the genocide. I had very deep relationships with people who ended up playing every role of the genocide, including being major perpetrators. And so having to confront that good people can do horrendous things was definitely one of the most painful reckonings in my life. But when I first went back in 1996, so people were still coming back from the refugee camps. Bodies were still in different exposed sites across the nation. I would sit with women who'd been part of my community, sometimes for 12, 13 hours a day. Not because I had signed up to do it, but because they needed someone to hear their stories. And I just happened to be there. And I think that also taught me how to listen, not just with my ears, but with all parts of myself. And that's also when I saw that this idea that there are good people and bad people is so broken, but that we have angels and monsters inside each of us, and that the monsters are actually our broken parts, our insecurities, our fears, and that in times of real insecurity, which is what we're going through right now with everything that's going on with our pandemic, our inequality, it becomes really easy to prey on those fears. And that's when we are at risk of doing terrible things. And as someone who has lost more people than I would like to admit, good people, there is no single thing we should be practicing more than listening and trying to break through the toxic identity politics that is between us.
Exactly. And that was beautiful. And what really hit home for me was that there are no good people and bad people. There's good and bad in everybody, or there's demons and angels in everyone. And I think we subconsciously a lot of times tend to project our own darkness onto others as well, and which creates a situation where we can't listen. And you also talk a lot about moral leadership. Can you speak to that just a little bit and what you mean by that?
Yeah, and it's important that when I talk about moral leadership, I'm not talking about righteousness or a set of rules prescribed from some higher authority. I'm really talking about the kind of leadership that starts by focusing on serving others, not yourself. Over the last 30, 50 years, we have become so hyper-individualistic as a society. And many of our leaders have defined their success by money, power, and fame. And that has seeped through into all of us, into our schools, into the way we too often raise our children. And that's what also needs to change, and I believe is changing. But it's the focus on moral leadership. I work primarily with entrepreneurs, individuals who are not simply trying to make money, but are using tools of business to solve really tough problems. They take risks. They fight a status quo that doesn't want to change. They are often not thanked for the work they do for many, many years. And yet it is because of them that I've seen entire systems change. This morning I spoke to one of our entrepreneurs from Chicago who went to Ethiopia, having never held a live chicken in his life. But the chicken industry there was so non-existent. It previously had been run by government, that he decided, well, maybe I'll just try. He's an incredible listener. He's an incredible boundary crosser with a great sense of humility. He said to me once, Dave, this is a guy named Decibels, if you go in as a guest and you act as a guest, maybe over time you'll be treated as a local. And that's exactly what happened to this young guy who learned Amharic, the local language, and really turned an economic model on its head. And it's a model that today is about a $50 million company that serves millions of low-income farmers across the nation, and has been credited by government in one region for reducing childhood malnutrition by 11%. That's the promise of moral leadership. But you're trusted. You earn trust not by pandering, and certainly not by listening just to what polls say, but by finding your truth, by daring to hold sometimes opposing beliefs, intention, as uncomfortable as that is, and always making decisions based on what's good for the whole and not just for you.
Right. You know, you brought up a good point there, and that is seeking truth, right? And we live in these boxes, and with echo chamber walls right now. We've put ourselves in boxes. Others have put us in boxes, and you talk about listening, right? And what I'm saying is that there is no listening beyond across the walls, right? So, we as you said, we have this really strong tendency to demonize others that have opposing views. Why should I listen? How do we answer somebody that says, why should I possibly listen to the other side? They want to turn our democracy into a socialist state. They're nothing but racists, or they get they don't think the news is, they think the news is completely false, and anything that the news says is untrue. And so there's this, we live in this incredible world of disinformation. We live in an interconnected world, which is this part of the subtitle of your first book, and which is true. We're hyper interconnected, hyper interdependent, but we have, if you layer on top of that interconnection all of these falsehoods, all of this misinformation, how does somebody navigate? On one of the folks who commented last week said, how do I'm completely exhausted trying to find what's true. How do I find what's true? So is there any, I know this is a really tough question, but is there any advice that you give folks? Because you're investing millions of dollars. So you have to come up with your best guess of what is true. So are any pointers on that?
First of all, I think we have to get beneath words, and we have to be very careful about the words that we use. We throw words like capitalist and socialist at each other.
Right.
Talk to me about the values underlying
yes
systems that we want to be building, and focus on yourself, not like you are this, you are a racist. That's pretty much a hard way to start a conversation that is going to be about finding truth. Rather, here's where I struggle, and here's where I see our systems really failing people of color. Here's where I think we have an opportunity that can also change a dynamic. Where I have found truth, and I think it's completely connected, Ron, to trust, is in one, in modeling it, is showing up over and over again, daring to sit with discomfort, and saying uncomfortable things out loud from a place that is clearly intending to do the right thing. Sharing failures. These are not the stuff we teach in business school.
Yeah.
Or frankly, in any of our schools. And what I found over the year, and I was just talking to my team about this because we recently got a big award from a financial institution, a grant, well, an investment. And I said, we never talk about the real hard skills. That yes, we're competitive in terms of knowing how to invest, but this was largely an investment made because we have earned trust, because for 15 years, we have shown up, told the truth, admitted failure, gotten back on the horse to work again, and bonds of truth get built. What's so hard in this toxic moment of social media is truth and trust take time. And so how do we also cultivate and inculcate in ourselves the idea that we have to build within ourselves the things that people can't take away from us? And first and foremost is our integrity and our reputation. And again, that's where the shift to these simple adages of give more to the world than you take, and move away from money, fame, and power, because at the end of the day, that's not where you create meaning and purpose anyway.
Right.
So I have found that people do tell the truth if you are willing to sit with the discomfort and offer the truth. But we have a long way to go at a societal level where we don't trust each other. We don't trust our institutions.
I think part of the reason why things are so amplified right now, the division is so amplified right now, is because people are really, really hurting. We've had, crisis after crisis after crisis. And, the pandemic is raging on. It's the worst it's ever been. There's a lot of things that are causing suffering to us as a nation, and around the world. And again, I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about we need to be careful about the words that we use and what those words mean, because there is a really, really strong tendency right now to label folks. So the world is so complicated right now. It's so complex. It's so scary with all the suffering that's going on, with all these crises that are going on. And I have found myself in a position where, in order to deal with all this, I have created a simplified framework to view the world through, right? And in this process of simplifying it and creating this filter to view the world in, I start making cubby holes, right? And I start putting groups and people and organizations and political parties into cubby holes, right? And each of the cubbies has its own little label on it, right? And that is the problem. The problem is that we are so quick to label people, label groups, and worse than that is these cubby holes. These cubby holes over here, these are the people that I'll listen to, that I'll talk to, that I respect their value in. These people over here, they don't know anything, and they provide no value to the equation. They're just trying to destroy everything. And so that's what's happening over and over and over again all around the world, particularly in the US right now, this oversimplification and this really knee-jerk reaction to label people. But if you dive in, well, what do you mean by that term? What do you mean? What is the motivation? I think you really hit that one on the head.
But Ron, also I think what we need more, especially in America today, is common problems that we're solving together.
Right.
And in that also, I think, has been the history of Acumen. When I step back and look at our community, which is now quite large and across the world, many of us were raised to hate each other. We are Indians and Pakistanis, and I mean, you name it. We are it. We are every religion. We are conservatives and we are liberals at the global level, which is a much larger spectrum than you would even find in the United States. And so what binds us, what allows us to get to know each other, is that we're focused on solving our real problems: healthcare, housing, energy. And in that solving of problems, we have a better chance to know each other. And that is the work we have to get back to doing as Americans. Culturally, this is an incredibly entrepreneurial nation. We are can-do. And what's been thrilling to me during COVID, which has been such a hard time full of so much despair for so many people, is that I'm watching the Acumen America entrepreneurs, Ron, just pivot, change the model, move from pragmatism. And so just two quick examples, because one's in urban LA and one's in rural Montana. In urban LA, a company called Every Table, they hire low-income people in Compton, in the southern part of the city, essentially to provide fast, nutritious, affordable meals in food deserts where there hasn't been affordable food. People so appreciated it that this company grew very quickly pre-COVID from 1 to 8 restaurants. When lockdown happened, the entrepreneur Sam Polk impulsively went back to his North Star, that he started this company to get people healthy food, not to just make money. And so he sent out a tweet and said, look, if you need a healthy meal, let us know. We'll deliver it to you. If you can't afford to pay it, we'll deliver it to you anyway. But if you can afford to pay it forward, here's a link. And within weeks, they had delivered something like 100,000 meals. And then when the government connected homeless people with hotels, they contracted with Every Table. And by now they've delivered over 3 million meals. And so you're watching consumers being turned into citizens, everyday philanthropists, government partnering with the private sector, jobs created, and nobody's asking the politics of each individuals, but we're solving a problem that hasn't been solved. And in Montana, we have a company called My Village, where you've got 127 essentially small businesses, women that run tiny daycare centers in their homes, 6 to 12 kids. And a woman who really learned how to build anti-fragile companies in Africa had this insight that if you could get women and train them in the rudiments of basic daycare and not create a franchise model or a network model, but a community model, they could provide really high quality, affordable daycare. And during COVID, Acumen got the call, like, I can't let 127 small businesses die in COVID. And these children who are being cared for have parents who are essential workers. And so again, with a quick pivot, going to philanthropy, partnering with government, that company is flourishing. And I think it could be a model for what we could do across the nation. We need more of these stories, Ron, that are stories of hope and of possibility and of human connection, because we can solve these problems.
What I'm getting from that is I mean, it's just proving the old adage: united we stand, divided we fall. And the problems that we face right now are so big that the only way we're going to solve them, the only way we're going to overcome these challenges, is by figuring out how to set aside our differences and work together. And it reminds me, I spent the first 15 years of my adult life training to fight the Russians. I was a Cold War fighter pilot, right? And I sat nuclear alert in West Germany back in the 80s, and we were always moments away from basically annihilating every living thing on the planet during that really, really tense moment. If you fast forward to 2011, I found myself in a former top secret Soviet military installation at the base of a rocket that would take us to space for 6 months. And I looked up at the rocket, and there was an American flag and a Russian flag side by side. And if that's not an example of beating swords into plowshares, if that's not an example of the power of setting aside our differences and working together towards something powerful and meaningful, I don't know what is. Because there was so much animosity between the Russians and the U.S. And when we were talking about bringing the Russians into the International Space Station program, there was all kinds of pundits, there was all kinds of voices all around the country, and actually the world, basically saying, how could we possibly consider doing anything with the Russians? We won't do anything with them until they stop doing X, Y, and Z, or start doing X, Y, and Z. Luckily, those voices didn't win out, and we did bring the Russians in. And what happened was, when we started working with the Russians and we started realizing that their desires in the space program are the same as ours, personal relationships started to develop, a certain level and foundation of trust started to develop. And now we have this platform, this international platform that contains 15 nations that can be used as a jump off point to start to address the things that we don't agree on. But what we tend to do is we tend to use the things we agree on as a stick to force the things that we don't agree on, and that never works. And so finding the common ground, I think what you're saying is finding this common ground, finding these problems and challenges that we can solve together, not overlooking those differences. That doesn't mean you approve of them. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. That just means that you have chosen to focus on the commonalities, on the things that you share versus the things that are driving you apart. And step by step, I think that leads us to progress. That leads us to a better world. It leads us to less divisiveness. And so we're at a fork right now, and we need to choose the fork towards greater unity.
I couldn't agree more. COVID has been very humbling to all of us. It was truly and has been like a heat-seeking missile aimed squarely at the poor and the vulnerable. And in the United States, people of color have been disproportionately impacted. And That's not a political statement. That's a factual statement. And we have to take that seriously and look at our systems
But I'll
together.
tell you, there are people that don't think that's true. There are people that think that that's a fabrication, or at least an exaggeration, that doesn't exist. I know many people, smart, well-meaning, kind people, who don't think that's a true statement. I think it's a true statement. I think that systemic racism is so obvious that it's like arguing whether the earth is flat or not. But there's, like I said, intelligent, well-meaning people who I respect who have a difference of opinion there and don't think that's true.
I mean, that you're getting us right back to where we are as a nation. And that's where we have to find our way to also looking at data and finding a way to trust it. You know, when 1 out of 3 African American or Black men in the United States end up somewhere in the criminal justice system, we got a problem. And if the problem doesn't look ugly enough in the United States, when you go to any of the countries in which I operate and they look at those statistics, it's with horror. In fact, Ron, when we first started to operate in the United States, I assumed that here we'd be learning about the poverty of inequality. I didn't understand that we would actually be seeing the poverty levels in absolute terms. And that in Southern India, where we operate, you have higher education rates, better maternal health rates, higher literacy rates than in some of the communities in the United States. We've got work to do. Mm-hmm. And the good news is, if we can see the problem, we can solve the problem. Yeah. And so part of the work that we have to do is to help each other see. And in that seeing, see one another too. But we cannot run away from our problems if we want to become what we're capable of being.
Right. And that reminds me of a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He says, "We cannot succeed by denying what exists. The acceptance of reality is the only place from which change can begin," which I think pretty much sums up where we're at right now, because there are vastly different views of what reality is right now. And that's part of the problem. And I know that we're coming up on the hour, and I know that you have to go. So I do want to wrap this up. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for all that you're doing in the world to make life on our planet as beautiful as it looks from space, through the many decades that you've done this. I recommend the blue sweater to everybody, but I also recommend Jacqueline's new book, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. And how can people find out more about Acumen? Jacqueline, where should they go to get more information on that?
Thanks for that. www.acumen.org or acumenacademy.org. And Ron, one of the things I just want to remind you of as well, it's such a pleasure to be here. And part of what we owe each other is to show up for each other. And there was a time when I was having an event with low-income, wonderful human beings from the slums of Nairobi. And somehow you managed to get a direct line from the space shuttle into the Nairobi slums to talk to these young men and let them know that they too were allowed to dream in the way that as a little boy you dreamed of being an astronaut. And I'll never forget that. That's what we're also talking about.
Well, that was my pleasure and my honor. And, you know, I really believe that we're going to get through this. We're going to get through all of these crises. We're going to get through all these problems. We're going to come out the other side stronger and more unified. I know it's hard to see that light at the end of the tunnel right now, but it's there. It's dim. And I think we're going to look back on this period of hardship and suffering and divisiveness and everything else, and we're going to see the growth that came out of it. You know, growth happens in dark times, right? And I think we will look back on this as a time of tremendous transition and tremendous growth for us as individuals and as a culture and as a society and as a nation. And thank you for being part of the immune response on our planet to help heal us all of this. So,
well, thank you, Ron, and thanks everyone for listening.
Yep, and with that, I'm gonna say goodbye to everybody as soon as I find the outro. There it is. But please join us next week, and stay safe over the week, and we'll see you back next week. Thank you for joining us during this conversation from the Orbital Perspective, and thank you for being a part of an emerging unity on our planet. We are strongest when we are aligned around the truth of our underlying unity. Together, we are unstoppable and can build a positive, restorative future, a future that we would all want to be a part of. Please subscribe to the Orbital Perspective podcast and follow us on social media. Thank you for all that you're doing and all that you will do to help make life on our planet as beautiful as it looks from space.